There are a lot of English versions of the Bible out there, and it is easy to find a number of well-done videos explaining the differences between the various English versions. And perhaps I'll include a link to some of them in the description of this video. And what I'd like to do here is just briefly go over the three main reasons that account for the variations in the different contemporary English versions of the Bible. Then after that, I think it would be more useful, instead of just explaining the process to you, actually demonstrate it to you. And you can see the various decisions that translators have to face that can result in very different renderings in English. All right, well, the first main reason that explains the differences between the various versions is agenda. This has to do with what's the purpose? What is the publisher trying to accomplish with their various versions? Are they trying to produce a version of the Bible that sounds good when it's read aloud? Or perhaps they're trying to create a version in plain, simple English that almost anyone could pick up and read. More often than not, the reason for creating new versions of the Bible in English is that the English language has changed. For example, the NIV was first published in 1978, then it was updated in 1984, then it was updated again in 2011 to account for both advances in biblical scholarship and also changes in the English language. For example, somewhere along the way there, they changed the English word booty to plunder. And I just imagine an academic conference of Bible translators with a scholar giving a presentation on the various contemporary uses of the word booty and why they shouldn't use it anymore in their translation. With a PowerPoint and everything, with pictures of pirates' treasure and other things. All right, moving on. The second major reason that accounts for the variations in the different English versions of the Bible is the source material that they're translating from. The different versions may be drawing upon different texts. Now, I'm using the word text here in a very technical way, meaning a scholarly reproduction of how the original may have read. Now, the original document created by the various biblical authors is what is known as an autograph. So, for example, Paul writing the book of Romans, whether he wrote it himself or used a secretary, that copy, that physical copy, would have been the autograph. Then all the copies of that copy would be what we call manuscripts. Now, we don't have the autograph anymore, but what we do have is a great pile of manuscripts. So what scholars do is they compile all of these manuscripts, and then from that manuscript evidence, they create a text. Now, there are two different ways this can be done. One is they look at all these manuscripts and say, there's a bunch over here that spell a certain word a different way than the rest of these over here. They're going to go with the majority. And this creates what's called a majority text. A second approach would be, when we see a variation among the manuscripts, is you weigh them. You consider, where did it come from? How old is it? Who copied it? And so on. Like, you may have a very old version of, let's say, the book of John, which we have a piece of that goes back to the mid-2nd century AD, which is fragmentary, but yet you have this other version that's complete and was copied by professionals in, say, a monastery or a library somewhere. You weigh the two. Yeah, this one's older and closer to the original in time, but yet this one was preserved and copied by professionals. So you'd weigh these, and then you'd pick which one you want to go with. And this is called an eclectic text. So you have a majority text and an eclectic text. Now, the different English translations of the Bible will use one or the other. And a lot of times, even though they're using one or the other to start with, they'll also compare and contrast the two. For example, you may be reading through your Bible and see a footnote, something like, more reliable manuscripts have this different word here or there. And while we're on the subject of discrepancies in manuscripts, I just want to go ahead and point out that the vast majority of these discrepancies are spelling differences. For example, a scribe, when they're making a copy, they may want to update some of the spellings of different words to more contemporary usages. so their readers could understand them more easily. It is rare that there's a difference between the manuscripts that is significant. One example would be the ending of the book of Mark. Some manuscripts are missing those last several verses there. And it is extremely rare that any of these discrepancies among manuscripts really has any impact on the meaning of any given passage. Now, the third major reason that accounts for the differences in the various English translations is the philosophy of translation, or rather the approach of the translator. For when one sits down to translate, one needs to decide whether they're going to go for a word-for-word translation, in other words, trying to find a single English word to match every single Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek word in whatever text you're translating. This is called formal equivalence. Or on the other hand, you can go for dynamic equivalence, which is you take the thought being communicated through a particular phrase in the original text and ask, what is the best way to say this in English? And that's dynamic equivalence. For example, English translations like the English Standard Version or the New Revised Standard Version, these are going to be more towards formal equivalence, more towards trying to find a single English word for every Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek word. Now, of course, the problem with this, there isn't a single English word that means exactly the same as any single Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek word. And actually, in fact, there isn't even a one-to-one equivalence when two people are speaking the same language. For example, if someone came into this room right now and say, "Surely you know what's going on," I may respond to them, "Yes, on my pizza, usually just cheese, and don't call me Shirley." So you see what happened there? I took an idiom and took it literally and interpreted another word by the way it sounded, not by what they meant. And that's in the same language. This level of confusion can be exponential when you translate from one language to the other, and even more so when you're moving from an ancient language in an ancient culture to a contemporary language like English. Now, a translation like the New International Version that I mentioned earlier actually tries to take the middle road here and tries to achieve a balance between formal equivalence and dynamic equivalence. And they also try to use plain English. Now, plain English often means boring English, but still an excellent translation. But a translation more towards the dynamic end of the spectrum would perhaps be the New Living Translation. Slightly more dynamic than the New International Version. An example of a version that's very much towards the end of the spectrum of dynamic equivalence is The Message. Actually, so much so you can't really call it a translation anymore. It's more of a paraphrase. All right. So the three major reasons, there are other reasons, but the three major ones that lie behind the differences between all of the different English translations and versions of the Bible that are out there are 1, the agenda, 2, what texts are they using, what source material, and 3, what is their approach, what is their philosophy of translation? Are they going for formal equivalence or dynamic equivalence? And most English versions of the Bible will actually be upfront with you about each of those three. Literally upfront. It's in the front of the Bible. You can read the introduction or preface to these different versions, and they'll tell you exactly who did the translation, what they were trying to accomplish, what their approach is, and normally what texts they used. All right, now we get to the fun part. What we're going to do is we're going to look at a verse from the Bible. We're going to look at Psalm 51, verse 10. So in order to show you how this works, we're going to take a verse and translate it both with an extreme version of formal equivalence and an extreme version of dynamic equivalence, so you can see the difference. And the verse we're going to look at is Psalm 51, verse 10. And the text we're going to use is called the BHS, Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. Yeah, that's kind of fun to say. Which is based off of the manuscript called the Leningrad Codex, and that dates to around AD 1008, and it's part of the family of texts called the Masoretic texts. And the reason we're choosing this one is because this is pretty much the text that most of your English versions of the Bible will be based on. Now, there are older versions of this text that we have. We have what's called the Aleppo Codex, but it's in the same family of texts, and it is identical in the verse we're looking at here. Now, there is an even older version from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of them date as far back as the middle of the 2nd century, BC. But there's a problem. This is a picture of the scroll 4Q85, which is a copy of the Psalms. And if you look right there, that text is actually the first several verses of Psalm 51. But as you notice, the rest of it is missing. It's broken. Yeah, maybe somebody's goat ate it or something. I don't know. But the verse we're looking at is missing. So this is why we're looking at the BHS. And like I said, it's a Masoretic text, and the short story about the Masoretes they are a group of Jewish scribes who were very much concerned with the preservation of the text and how it was read. So what they did is they put all of these marks around the letters that you see here, and they are indications of vowels and different reading marks or canticle marks. Now, the first thing I want to point out is a small canticle mark. Looks like a little wishbone. It's called the Atna. And what it indicates is that our verse here is actually broken up into 2 phrases. So the first phrase, Lev Tehor Bara Li Elohim. And the second phrase, Wa Ruach Nakon Chadesh Bekirbi. And what we have here is what's called a synonymous parallelism. Our 2 phrases are synonyms. They both say the same thing, just using slightly different words. And our 2 Hebrew phrases here, much like English sentences, have a subject, a verb, and an object. The verb being the action, the subject being the one who does the action, and the object being the thing acted upon. Like in the English sentence, the flying saucer landed on the White House lawn. The flying saucer is the subject, landed is the verb, and on the White House lawn is the object. Now, the subject in our verse here is actually shared between the 2 phrases. The author, instead of repeating the subject for each of the phrases, just stuck it in between the 2 of them. So that word there, Elohim, is our subject, the one doing the action. For simplicity, we're just going to go ahead and translate that word as the English word God, capital G-O-D. Now, let's work our way through the first phrase, word for word. And we're going to try and come up with a single English word to the best of our ability for each of these Hebrew words. And we'll see what happens. So first word, lev, literally means the heart, the organ, the blood pump, the thump-thump. But the problem with translating that word heart is in English we associate that word with things like emotions and feelings. Not so in the Hebrew. It has more to do with reason or thoughts than it does emotions. And it is very much associated with wisdom. Now, the second word, tahor, it's a verb, but it's being used as an adjective, and it can mean clean or purified. We're going to go ahead and translate it as clean. And the next word, bara, is the verb. Now, this word is almost always translated as create. For example, it's the same word used in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created. But it carries with it a connotation of bringing order out of chaos, in the sense of separating and organizing. In the creation narrative of Genesis 1, the chaos waters are separated, and God continues to separate land and sea, night and day, etc., etc. And any Hebrew reader coming across that word would definitely associate it with stories about creation, and especially because this verb here it is inflected in what is called the call imperative. And whenever this verb appears in the call stem throughout the entire Hebrew Bible, God is always the subject. And the fact that it's inflected as an imperative tells us that this whole verse here is either a command or a request. And since the context is that this entire psalm is a prayer for forgiveness, we can take this as a request or a plea. So we can translate this verb here as a plea to bring into order out of chaos. So we're going to go ahead and use the word order. And this next word, li, is the preposition to or for, plus the first person personal pronoun, me or I. So this is for me. And then we have our subject, Elohim. Now the second phrase, since it's a synonymous parallelism, we're going to expect a lot of the same elements and in very close meanings to the words in the first phrase. The first word, ruach, the w on the front of that is a prefix, and it's the conjunction. We're just going to go ahead and translate it and the word ruach literally means breath, and it's associated with things like speech or thoughts, and it's also associated with wisdom, much like our word for heart in the first phrase. An example of this would be in the Joseph story. After Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream and lets him know his plan for surviving the impending famine, Pharaoh says, well, this guy's really smart. He has the Ruach Elohim, the breath of God or the words of God in him. Now, this word is usually translated spirit, but that's not necessarily very helpful here for understanding its meaning. The English word spirit has a lot of connotations that have nothing to do with the Hebrew word. And another interesting fact about this word, it would also bring to mind to the Hebrew reader thoughts about creation stories. So in Genesis 1, you have the Ruach Elohim, or the Spirit of God that moves over the surface of the waters. And then later through that whole narrative, God speaks and says, let there be light, and so on. So we're going to be super literal and translate this word breath for now. And the next word, nachon, it's parallel with our word for clean in the first phrase. And again, it's a verb that's used as an adjective here. And it means to straighten out or to stand up in the sense of like cleaning up a disorganized room. Like in an apartment after a party the night before, you have to flip over the couch, straighten out the cushions, stand the refrigerator back up, rehang the curtains, put the TV back on its stand. You have to straighten out. You have to organize. And it can also mean like steadfast or like something solid or reliable in the sense of a stool that's fallen over is not very useful. But if you stand it up, you can sit on it. You can trust it to hold you up. So we're going to translate this as sort out, like one sorts out a mess. Next word, chadash, means to renew or revive. And again, like our verb in the first phrase, this verb is also an imperative. So it's part of the plea. So renew. And the next word, bekirbi, has the prefix be, which is the preposition in or with. And there's a suffix on this word, the hirik yod there on the end. That is our first person singular pronoun, I or me, just like in the first phrase. And the word itself means intestines or guts. It is in the guts is where the ruach resides. So we can translate this in the guts of me. So now, our super formal equivalent translation of this verse would read something like, heart clean order for me, God, and breath sort out, renew in the guts of me. Yeah, and as you can see, that is just awful. That is terrible English. It is nearly incomprehensible. But yet, at the same time, it's a perfectly accurate translation. Now, of course, this is an extreme version of a formal equivalence. Now, let's go to the other extreme, and let's see if we can come up with a dynamic equivalent translation. Now, the context of this psalm is David dealing with his guilt after committing rape, murder, and conspiracy to cover it up. He is directly facing his own patterns of thought that created this situation in the first place. He's asking God to correct them. It's as if he's saying, hey, God, you brought the whole universe to order out of chaos. You should be able to clean this mess up. So, given that context and the allusion to the creation story by the use of the very specific terminology in this passage, perhaps a dynamic equivalent or thought-for-thought translation would be something like, God, please, order my mind. That is to say, like you did when you created the cosmos, and renew and sort out my deepest thoughts, just like you did to the chaos at the beginning of the universe. Now, as you can see, that reads a little better, makes a little more sense, and picks up on some of the allusions to the creation language, but it's still a bit awkward, and a lot of those words aren't even there in the original text we were translating. Now, most of your popular English versions today are going to fall somewhere in between these two extremes. And let's just look at a few. Let's start by looking at the Authorized Version, published in 1611, otherwise known as the King James Version. And this is how it originally looked. And no, those aren't spelling errors. That's just how English was done back in the day. And you can see it's very much going with formal equivalence. It preserves a lot of the word order of the original Hebrew text. But I'm showing it to you so you can see that language is a fluid thing. It's always changing. There's always going to be a need for these translations to be updated so contemporary people can read them and understand them. And in the case of this version, there has been quite a bit of advances in biblical scholarship, and there is a vast amount of more manuscripts available than there was in 1611. One major advance in the textual evidence for the Old Testament specifically was the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947. Although for the verse we're looking at, that wasn't too helpful, perhaps due to that scroll-munching goat. Now here are two contemporary English versions. They're both using the same Hebrew text, slightly different agenda, and a different philosophy of translation. Here, the English Standard Version is trying to go for a formal equivalence. And as you can see, they changed the word order a little bit to make it a little more readable, but kept the overall structure. And as you can see, they rendered lev and ruach as heart and spirit, which is fine, but potentially misleading considering the contemporary English meanings of these words. Now, the Message is very much going for a dynamic equivalence. And as you can see, they moved the subject to the beginning of the sentence, which is more typical of the way people speak and write English. And you can see they emphasize the allusion to the creation narrative, whereas the English Standard Version, it may not come across as clearly. And you can see that the Message avoids the potential confusion of using words like heart and spirit by just using the word life, although a bit vague. You lose that the author was specifically referencing something more akin to what we would call the mind. Now, these are both legitimate ways of rendering the Hebrew text into English. It's just that each had their own approach, and they were trying to accomplish something different with their particular version. Now, I guess the takeaway from this whole exercise is that no matter what English version of the Bible you prefer, it is important to remember that it is a translation. It is meant to serve as a bridge between you and the ancient literature of the Bible, and that's all it can do. Whether you prefer a version that's more of a formal equivalent translation, or you prefer a version that's more of a dynamic equivalent translation, well, know that they're both translations. There's a specific purpose behind the English wording that they produce. And just as I made choices all along the way as I was translating Psalm 51 verse 10, it is the same with all of these other English translations. Although in their case, especially the ones I've mentioned in this video, an enormous amount of work and scholarship goes into producing them. Talking about whole teams and committees of people arguing and struggling over every word in order to best bridge that gap between their readers and the ancient text. Now, hopefully this has been useful to you, or at least interesting.